Some stories are better heard with someone else. But you're here alone. Welcome to Don't Listen Alone. This is 100% ad-free, just you and whatever comes next. Drop your location and the time before we begin. Now, listen carefully. Not everything you hear is part of the story. On October 9, 2007, my family held the funeral for my sister, Noi. Even now, when I think back to that day, it feels heavy in a way that is hard to explain. Some days, grief feels sharp and loud. Other days, it feels still, almost quiet, but somehow heavier. That funeral day carried both feelings at once. It was full of people, movement, voices, prayer, ritual, and tradition, yet underneath all of it there was this deep silence that seemed to sit inside every member of my family. We all knew we were moving through a moment that could never be repeated. We were saying goodbye in the way our family knew best, surrounded by our faith, our customs, and the people who loved my sister. It was one of the hardest days of my life, but it was also one of the most meaningful because so much of what happened that day showed who my sister was, what our family believed, and how deeply love reaches even after death. The funeral began with the regular prayer, but after that came the Buddhist ceremony. I remember being surprised by how many people stayed for that part. A handful of people did leave after the earlier service, but many more remained than I had expected. That stayed with me because it made me realize how much people wanted to be present, not only for the easy part of saying goodbye, but for the deeper, more spiritual part too. Our family is Buddhist, though we are open to other religions, and many of the people around us may not have fully understood everything happening in that ceremony. Still, they stayed. They watched with respect. They wanted to honor my sister and stand with us in whatever way they could. I remember feeling touched by that, even through all the sadness. There is something comforting about seeing people remain close in a moment of loss, especially when they do not share all your customs, but still choose to stay and honor them anyway. My mother has always been very close to the Laos Temple in Catlett, Virginia, Wat Laos Budhavan. Because of that connection, monks came to the funeral in person. That made the entire day feel even more sacred. Their presence changed the atmosphere immediately. When monks enter a space, especially a space filled with grief, they carry with them a certain stillness. It is not silence exactly, but peace, discipline, and purpose. I remember their chanting very clearly. It filled the room in a way that did not feel like ordinary sound. It felt like something larger than words, something ancient and holy moving through the air. Even if someone did not understand the language or the full meaning of every chant, they could still feel that the moment mattered. During the ceremony, each member of the family was lined up in front of my sister's casket. It was one of those moments where everything slows down. People are moving, but inside you, time feels strange. Each of us held a monk's robe in our hands. Inside the robe were flowers, candles, our name, and cash. We were told to place those things on top of my sister because she was going to be cremated with them. The meaning behind those items was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. They were there to provide for her on her journey. They were not random objects. They were offerings of love, care, blessing, and support. The flowers, the candles, the robe, the money, all of it had meaning. In that moment, it felt like we were not just standing by her casket in sorrow. We were also helping her prepare for whatever came next. That part of the ritual moved me deeply. It is one thing to lose someone and stand helpless in grief. It is another thing to be given away, through ritual, to still care for them. That is how it felt to me. We were not only mourning her. We were still giving to her, still sending her onward with what she would need. There was something gentle in that. Something loving. The monks explained that once the strings and flowers were cut away, it symbolized the release of her spirit and allowed her to go on. Even now, that image stays with me. The idea of release. The idea that part of loving someone after death is helping them let go and move forward, even when your own heart wants to hold on. After the ceremony ended, the monks followed my parents back to their house, along with friends and other family members. That too was part of the rhythm of those days after her death. People stayed close. They came, prayed, sat with us, and helped carry the sorrow. My family did not go through that week alone, and I think that made a difference. Grief can be isolating, but there is something deeply healing in shared ritual, shared meals, and shared remembrance. On that particular evening, though, I followed my oldest sister and her friends back to her house because she also had people there. It was one of those strange things that happens after a funeral. Everyone scatters to different places, and yet the same grief follows them all. No matter which house we went to, the feeling came with us. That night, I had the saddest, scariest, and most vivid dream I had ever had about my sister. It was the first time I saw her face in a dream since she had passed away on October 4th. The fact that it happened that very night, after the ceremony, after the chanting, after the offering, made it feel immediately important. Dreams can be many things. Sometimes they are just pieces of memory and emotion coming together while the mind sleeps. But other times, especially after a death, they feel like something more. They feel like a visit, a message, a final conversation, or at least something that deserves attention. This dream felt like that. In the dream, the first thing that struck me was her appearance. Noi had blonde hair with red streaks. That detail looked so strange to me in the dream, so different from how I knew her, that it stayed in my mind right away. Even inside the dream, I remember noticing it and being confused. Why would her hair look like that? Why would she appear that way to me? But in dreams, questions do not always stop the moment from moving forward. They just sit there in the background while everything continues. So I kept watching her, and somehow, even though her appearance was unusual, I still knew completely that it was her. In the dream, she and I were at my parents' house. That made sense to me because that was where so much of our family life centered, especially during that week. She was packing up her things. Not in a frantic way, and not in a confused way, but with purpose, like someone who had made a decision and was preparing to leave. There was something heartbreaking about watching her do that. She was not acting scared. She was not upset. She seemed calm, almost peaceful, but the fact that she was packing at all filled me with sadness. Dreams often carry feelings in ways that are even stronger than waking life, and the moment I saw her gathering her things, I felt that familiar sinking in my chest that comes when you realize goodbye is truly happening. I asked her where she was going. She answered me so simply, so naturally, like this was just an ordinary move. She told me, "I'm moving out, Joy. I found a really nice barn or garage apartment right behind Mom and Dad's work. It is perfect because I can display all of my artwork like my own little gallery, and it will only cost me pennies." That whole answer stayed with me because it sounded so much like her. There was something personal in it, something specific and almost practical. She was not describing some strange, floating place in the sky or some vague spiritual world. She was talking about an apartment, a place to live, a place where she could display her art, a place that suited her. That detail about her artwork mattered too, because art was such a real part of who she was. In the dream, she did not speak in symbols only. She spoke as herself. She was going somewhere that fit her, somewhere that made sense to her spirit, somewhere she could still be surrounded by her own creative world. When she said it would only cost her pennies, I remember reacting almost like I would have if we were having a normal conversation. I said something like, "Pennies? Wow, that is cheap." Even in the dream, there was this strange mix of sadness and ordinary talk, which made the whole thing feel even more real. Dreams after a loss can be like that. They hold both the impossible and the familiar at once. One part of you knows this is no normal conversation because the person is gone. Another part of you speaks to them exactly the way you always would have. Then I cried as she grabbed her things. That part feels so painful to remember because even in the dream I knew what was happening. I knew she was leaving. I knew that even though she was speaking to me gently and calmly, this was not a small goodbye. This was not someone moving down the street. It felt final in a deeper way, and I cried because I did not want her to go, even if I could tell she had already accepted where she was headed. She looked at me and told me she loved me. She told me everything would be okay. Then she disappeared. When I woke up, the dream stayed with me immediately. There are dreams that fade the moment your eyes open, becoming thin and hard to hold onto. This was not one of those. This one came back with full feeling the second I woke. I remembered her face. I remembered the hair. I remembered the packing. I remembered the apartment behind my parents' work. I remembered her saying it would cost pennies. I remembered her saying she loved me and that everything would be okay. And I remembered how alone I felt the second she was gone. The next morning, we had a family gathering at my parents' house. This time it was only family, not the larger crowd of friends, visitors, and monks who had been there through the days before. For the whole week leading up to her funeral, my parents had filled the house with prayers. Friends came. Family members came. Monks came. There had been private prayers for Noi all through that week. It was as though the entire house had become a place of mourning and transition, full of ritual and emotion. By the morning after the funeral, the atmosphere had shifted slightly. It was still deeply sad, of course, but quieter, more intimate, almost like the family had reached the point where we needed to sit with each other more privately and try to understand what had just happened. When I arrived at the house that morning, one of the first things I noticed was the white string. It was everywhere. The whole house seemed to be covered with it, and there was string going around the backyard as well. I remember being struck by how unusual it looked. It did not feel decorative. It felt intentional, protective, and symbolic, even before anyone fully explained it to me. White string stretched across the home and outside around the yard gave the whole place a sense of being marked or sealed in some way. It was one of those things that instantly tells you there is meaning here, even if you do not yet know exactly what that meaning is. While we were eating outside, surrounded only by family, I told them about the dream. I told them how Noi had appeared to me. I told them about the blonde hair with red streaks. I told them how she was packing all her things. I told them about the barn or garage apartment behind Mom and Dad's work, about her saying it was perfect for displaying her art like a little gallery, and about how it would only cost pennies. I told them she had said she loved me, that everything would be okay, and then disappeared. My sister Janet was the first to speak about the hair. She told me that Noi appeared with blonde hair and red streaks because her best friend Masha had that exact hair color. When Janet said that, something in me shifted. Suddenly what had seemed random in the dream did not feel random at all. It made sense in a deeply emotional way. If Noi had appeared to me with hair like Masha's, maybe it was because she was connected in some way to that friendship, or because that image represented comfort, love, memory, or some piece of her identity that I had not consciously thought of in the dream. It was such a specific detail that hearing Janet explain it made the dream feel even more meaningful. Then my mother explained the part about Noi moving out. She said that in the dream, Noi was leaving because her spirit was no longer allowed to return to the house. The white strings covering the house and yard were part of that. They were there to keep her away and to remind her that she had to continue on with her journey. When my mother said that, the dream made another kind of sense. Suddenly it was not only about packing and leaving in an ordinary way. It was about transition. It was about my sister understanding that she could no longer stay tied to the house, to us, to the life she had just left. She had to move on. The strings, according to my mother, were a spiritual boundary. They were not there to reject her in a cruel way. They were there to guide her, to keep her from getting stuck, to tell her with love that she could not stay here anymore. That explanation broke my heart in a different way. There was something deeply sad in the idea that a spirit could still feel drawn back to home, to family, to the familiar places of life, and yet need to be lovingly turned away so that it could continue on. But there was also something beautiful in it. My family, through faith and ritual, was still caring for her. Even the act of creating that boundary was a loving act. It was not abandonment. It was release. Then there was the detail about the pennies. I never even had to ask anyone what that part of the dream might mean, because as we were talking, I suddenly remembered what the monks had done the day before. Before we cremated her, they had placed aluminum foiled pennies inside her box. That memory came back to me with full force. Once I remembered that, The line in the dream made perfect sense. When she said her new place would only cost pennies, it connected directly to what had been placed with her. The monks had given her pennies for the journey, and in my dream, she spoke of pennies as the cost of her new place. It was such a strange and specific detail that I could not ignore it. That was one of the reasons the dream felt so powerful to me afterward. It contained symbols and meanings that matched real actions from the ceremony, actions I had not consciously been analyzing when I fell asleep. The hair, the moving out, the strings, the pennies, the artwork, all of it connected to real parts of her life, real parts of our ritual, real parts of the spiritual framework my family was living through at that exact time. It did not feel random. It felt like a message shaped in the language my heart could understand. And the artwork mattered deeply. My sister's art was not just something she did. It was part of her spirit. It was one of the clearest ways she expressed herself in the world. She was gifted, sensitive, and deeply spiritual, and her artwork reflected that side of her in ways words often could not. That is why, after all of this, I wanted to share her work with other people. I attached a YouTube slideshow to the story because I wanted others to see her gift. Her artwork says things about her soul that ordinary descriptions cannot fully capture. Looking at it, you can feel how much of her inner world lived inside what she created. That may be why the dream placed such emphasis on her wanting a space to display all her artwork. It was not just about moving somewhere else. It was about going somewhere where she could still be fully herself, still surrounded by what mattered to her, still present in the form of what she made. The image of her having her own little gallery touched me so deeply because it sounded perfect for her. It sounded like the kind of place she would love, the kind of place where she would feel seen and at peace. For a long time after that dream, I kept thinking about the way she said everything would be okay. Those words matter so much after a loss. When someone dies, especially someone close, the world feels broken in a way that words from the living often cannot fix. People say kind things, they mean well, they offer comfort, but grief has its own weight, and it does not always let words in. But when the person you lost seems to come to you, even in a dream, and tells you directly that they love you and that everything will be okay, it reaches you differently. Whether someone sees that as spiritual, symbolic, emotional, or some mixture of all those things, the impact is real. For me, it was both comforting and devastating. Comforting because I felt she had reached out. Devastating because even in that contact, she was still leaving. That is what makes the dream one of the saddest things I have ever experienced. It gave me something precious, one more moment with her, one more conversation, one more goodbye. But it also made the goodbye deeper and more real. She was not just absent anymore. In the dream, she was actively moving on. She was telling me that in the best way she could, and part of me understood it even while another part of me wanted to hold on. I also think often about how the dream happened the very night after the Buddhist ceremony. That timing feels important to me. The monks had chanted. We had laid the robe, flowers, candles, names, and money over her. The strings and flowers had been cut to release her spirit. Rituals had been performed to help her journey begin properly. Then that very night, I dreamed of her packing her things and moving to a new place where she could not stay with us anymore. To me, the connection is impossible to ignore. It feels as if the dream was part of that same transition, almost like the spiritual work done during the day opened a space for one final communication at night. Some people may hear all this and think grief created the dream. And perhaps grief was certainly part of it. Of course it was. I was grieving. My family was grieving. Everything in my mind and heart was centered on her. But even if grief shaped the dream, that does not make it meaningless. In fact, sometimes grief and the spiritual are not enemies of each other. Sometimes they are the very place where meaning breaks through. Whether she truly visited me or whether my heart and spirit found a way to understand what was happening through a dream, the experience still mattered deeply and still carried truth for me. The white strings around the house stayed in my mind too. There was something so visual and memorable about them. They turned the whole home into a kind of sacred boundary. I can still picture them stretched across the house and yard while family gathered outside and talked softly over food. It was as though our ordinary home had been transformed into a place of passage, where the living remained inside one kind of world and the dead were gently shown the path toward another. The strings did not feel cruel to me once I understood them. They felt protective, purposeful, and sad in a way only true ritual can be sad. That whole week before the funeral had already felt spiritually intense. My parents had opened the house to monks, family, friends, and prayer. For 7 days, everything revolved around Noi. There were private prayers. There were visitors. There was grief moving through every room. Then after the ceremony, the dream gave everything a final emotional image I have never forgotten. She was not trapped. She was not frightened. She was not lost. She was simply moving on, carrying what she needed, still herself, still an artist, still my sister, but now on a road I could not walk with her. I think that is one reason the dream, though sad, also brought me a kind of peace. It did not erase grief. Nothing could do that. But it changed grief. It gave it form. It turned my sister's death into a journey rather than only an ending. In the dream, she had somewhere to go. She had a place that suited her. She had what she needed. She had love. She had purpose. And she told me everything would be okay. When you lose someone, those are the kinds of images that keep your heart from breaking completely. There was also something deeply personal in the fact that she spoke to me as she always would have. She called me Joy. She did not speak like some distant spiritual being full of mystery. She spoke like my sister. That matters. It keeps the dream rooted in relationship rather than symbolism alone. It was not just that I saw a vague image of her leaving. I spoke with her. She answered me. She told me where she was going and why. The language was simple, familiar, and human. That is one of the reasons I hold the dream so closely. It did not take her away from me as a person. If anything, it reminded me of her personality one more time. I also find it meaningful that her new place in the dream was not grand or impossible. It was humble, even practical. A barn or garage apartment. A place behind Mom and Dad's work. A place that cost pennies. A place where her art could hang. There is something almost tender in that. It was not some glowing palace. It was a place that sounded reachable, personal, comfortable, and hers. Maybe that was the only way my mind and spirit could understand transition. Or maybe that was truly how she wanted to show it to me, in a form that felt close to ordinary life so I would not be afraid for her. The more I think about it, the more I believe that dream was her way of giving me one last understandable goodbye. Not a final disappearance into mystery, but a goodbye with details. A goodbye with meaning. A goodbye with love. And for that, I will always be grateful, no matter how much it hurt. There are some dreams that belong only to sleep, and there are others that become part of waking life because of what they leave behind. This one has stayed with me ever since. It changed the way I looked at the ceremony, at the strings, at the pennies, at the whole week of prayer and ritual. It made everything feel connected in a way I had not fully understood before. It also made me feel closer to my family's spiritual traditions. Sometimes when people grow up with religious customs, they understand them more through practice than through deep reflection. But when a moment like this happens, those customs suddenly become alive with meaning in a way you can never ignore again. That is why I wanted to share the dream and my sister's artwork with others. Her art shows how spiritual she was, and it feels right that people should see that part of her. Even in death, that part of her came through so clearly. In the dream, she did not say she wanted luxury or comfort in the ordinary sense. She wanted a place for her art. That says so much about who she was. It says that creativity, spirit, beauty, and expression were not separate from her life. They were part of her soul. I think sometimes about what it must have felt like for my mother to explain the white strings to me that morning. She had already carried the weight of preparing the rituals, welcoming monks, following tradition, and mourning her daughter. Yet she was still able to look at my dream and understand it through the lens of faith and ritual. She saw the meaning in it immediately. She knew why Noah was moving out. She knew why the strings mattered. She knew that the house had to become a place the spirit could not return to. There is something strong and heartbreaking in a mother having to help release her own child in that way. I cannot think about it without feeling deep respect for her. My sister Janet's explanation about the hair also showed me how family memory works after loss. We each hold different pieces of a person. One notices a hairstyle connected to a best friend. Another understands a ritual. Another remembers the pennies. Another understands the art. When all those pieces come together, the dream becomes richer and fuller. That is part of why family gatherings after death are so important. Meaning often does not come to one person alone. It comes through shared memory. And in that way, my dream did not belong only to me after I told it. It became part of the family's understanding of Noi's journey. Once I shared it, everyone helped make sense of it, not in a way that reduced it, but in a way that honored it. They did not laugh it off. They did not dismiss it. They listened, and then they helped interpret the details through love, memory, and our spiritual tradition. That made the dream even more sacred to me. Even now, if I speak about her, I often think first of her art and that dream. Those two things are tied together in my mind. The art shows who she was in life, and the dream showed me something of who she remained after death. They are not separate. They both carry the same spirit of beauty, symbolism, and feeling. And maybe that is why I wanted to share her artwork publicly. It was not only to remember her. It was also to let others see the part of her that still feels alive to me. When I say that the dream was sad, scary, and vivid, I mean all of those things equally. It was sad because she was leaving. It was scary because death had become intimate, personal, and near in a way that no ordinary thought of loss ever is. It was vivid because every detail felt sharp and meaningful, from the color of her hair to the pennies to the apartment for her art. But underneath all of that, it was also loving. That is perhaps the most important thing. It was a goodbye shaped by love, not by fear. And that is what I hold on to most. She was moving on. She loved me. She told me everything would be okay. And in some strange, painful, beautiful way, I believe she was right. This happened when I was around 16 years old, during a time in my life when strange things were already happening often enough that fear had become almost a normal part of being in that house. By then, I was no longer at the stage where every unusual thing could be laughed off or forgotten by the next day. Too many little moments had already built up inside me. Too many feelings, sounds, and odd experiences had left me with the constant sense that something in the house was aware of us. Even when nothing obvious was happening, there was often a certain tension in the air, as if the house itself could change mood without warning. Some rooms felt heavier than others. Some corners felt as if they were being watched. Some objects seemed too ordinary to matter, until one day they suddenly became part of something much more frightening. One of those objects was a clock in the kitchen. It was not some small cheap clock sitting on a shelf. It hung on the back wall of the kitchen, directly above the sink, right in the center where anyone standing in that room would naturally notice it. It had a glass door over the face, and that glass door had a latch to keep it closed. It looked secure. It looked like the kind of thing that simply belonged there, part of the room, part of the everyday background of family life. But over time, that clock became one of the strangest things in the entire house. Every member of my family had some kind of experience with that clock. The most common thing was the little glass door opening by itself. It did not happen once or twice in some random way that could be blamed on loose hinges or someone forgetting to latch it. It happened enough that all of us became aware of it, and enough that each person in the family, in one way or another, came to associate that clock with whatever spirit or presence seemed to be living in the house with us. The strange thing was that even though everyone else had some experience with it, I was the only one who had never actually seen the door open for myself. My younger sister, for example, had one experience with it that stayed with all of us. She had never really been bothered by the spirit in the way some of the rest of us were. It was almost like whatever was in the house focused on some people more than others, and she was one of the lucky ones who had mostly been left alone. But one evening she was in the kitchen doing the dishes. It was an ordinary enough moment, the kind of normal family scene you do not expect to become part of a ghost story later. She was standing there washing dishes, probably half lost in her own thoughts, when right before her eyes she saw the door to the clock swing open on its own. That was her first truly direct experience with it, and it scared her so badly that she could not finish the dishes. She left the kitchen and refused to go back in there for the rest of the night. That tells you something right away, because my sister was not someone who frightened easily over silly things. If she had simply heard a little noise, or if the latch had seemed loose, she would not have reacted that strongly. But seeing that door open by itself, clearly and directly, was enough to shake her in a way that made the whole thing impossible to dismiss. And by that time, that kind of thing had already been happening for a while. The door opening on its own had become one of the repeating little signs that the house was not right. Yet somehow, I still had not seen it happen. And that bothered me. Not because I wanted another frightening experience, but because when you are already living in a house where strange things keep happening, being the only one not to witness one specific piece of it almost makes you feel like you are waiting for your turn. I had heard the stories. I had seen my sister's fear. I had lived through other strange things in the house. So every time someone mentioned the clock door opening, a part of me would think, why have I never seen it myself? It was a question that kept coming back to me. Then one evening I got my answer. I remember that night very clearly. I was sitting in the dining area, which was to the right of the kitchen. From there, you could still see into part of the kitchen, and the clock was visible enough to notice if you looked up. I was sitting there coloring in a medieval coloring book. Of all things, I was coloring a picture of the Lady in Death. Even now, that detail stands out to me because it feels strangely fitting, almost like one of those tiny eerie details that means nothing and everything at once. I was there, quietly coloring, focused on an image of death, while the house around me sat in that uneasy stillness I had become used to. At some point, I glanced up at the clock, and I remember thinking to myself, with everything else that had already happened to me in that house, why had I still never seen the door open? It was just a thought. A passing thought. One of those little questions you ask inside your own head without expecting anything to answer. I finished coloring. Then I got up and started walking toward my bedroom. To get there, I had to step into the kitchen. As soon as I put one foot into that room, I happened to look up at the clock again. And in that exact moment, it came off the wall. Not slipped. Not tilted. Not slowly worked loose and dropped. It was ripped off the wall. That is the only way I can describe it, because that is what it looked like. It came down forcefully, violently, with a loud crashing sound that filled the kitchen and made my whole body jump. It did not fall lightly. It slammed down flat on its bottom, crashing into the dish rack and sending forks and knives flying across the kitchen floor. Some of them landed right at my feet. It was so sudden, so loud, and so aggressive that for 1 second it felt less like an object falling and more like something was being thrown in anger. That was exactly how it felt. Anger. I swear, as it happened, I heard a faint growl. Not a full human voice. Not a loud animal sound. Just something low and ugly and barely there, but enough that it seemed to come with the crash like part of the same moment. And along with that, I felt this huge burst of energy force itself in my direction. It is hard to explain that to people who have never felt something like it. It was not just fear coming from inside me. It felt like something external, like a wave of rage or pressure being thrown at me from the room itself. The force of it made the whole moment feel targeted, as if whatever had pulled that clock off the wall was doing it right in front of me on purpose. I was terrified. Not the kind of startled fear where you scream and then laugh nervously afterward. I mean real terror. The kind that makes your whole body want to escape as fast and as far as possible. In that moment, I wanted to run out of the house and halfway up the block and never look back. That was the instinct in me. Get out. Leave. Do not stay in this room 1 second longer. Instead, I ran into the living room. I hit the couch so hard that I practically fell onto my older sister's lap. I was shaking, panicked, and trying to explain what had just happened. but the first thing my older sister said to me was, "What the hell did you do?" That probably would have been the natural reaction for anyone who had not seen it happen. From her point of view, I had just come flying out of the kitchen like I had caused some huge mess. But I kept trying to explain that I had not done anything. I had not touched the clock. I had not hit the wall. I had not been anywhere near it. I had just stepped into the kitchen and watched it get torn down right in front of me. She told me I needed to go clean up my mess. But I was too afraid to go back in there. I kept repeating, over and over, that I did not do it. It is strange how helpless that kind of moment can make you feel. Not only are you terrified, but you also know that what you saw is going to sound unbelievable to anyone who did not witness it themselves. So you are stuck between fear and frustration. You know what happened, but the room still has to be cleaned, the broken scene in the kitchen still exists, and you do not know how to make anyone understand that it was not you. A couple of hours later, my father got home. By then I was still shaken, and I told him the whole story. He listened, and unlike my sister, he actually went into the kitchen to look at the clock and the wall carefully. The clock was still sitting on the back of the sink where it had fallen. The forks and knives had already made their violent flight across the room. The whole thing still carried that aftershock feeling, as if the room remembered what had happened. As my father examined the clock, we all noticed something important. The nails that had been holding the clock in place were still there in the wall. They had not come loose and fallen out. They were still intact. But they were bent downward. And on the back of the clock, there were grooves in the wood where the nails had dragged. That detail mattered because it showed exactly how the clock had come off. It had not simply slipped upward and off. It had not dropped because of weak hanging. It had been pulled hard enough that the nails bent downward and dragged grooves into the wood. My father even said it really did look like someone had just come up and ripped it off the wall. That was his own conclusion. And this was not some badly hung decoration that had been loose to begin with. The clock had been very secure on that wall. Everyone in the family knew that. It would have taken something major to make it fall in the first place. My father even said it would have taken an earthquake to knock it loose like that. Yet there had been no earthquake. There had only been me stepping into the kitchen, looking up, and watching it get violently torn down right in front of me. After that, my father took action. He permanently glued the door shut so it could no longer swing open on its own. He also replaced the nails and made absolutely sure the clock was much more secure on the wall this time. We all wanted that particular object under control. There had already been too many strange incidents with the clock door, and after seeing the whole thing ripped off the wall, no one wanted to leave any room for another repeat. It felt like one of those practical responses families make when something paranormal has entered ordinary life. Fix the object. Secure the room. Eliminate the physical way it can happen again. Maybe that will stop it. But even that did not fully settle things. Later on, my father claimed that one evening he was up late by himself, and he could hear the door of the clock jiggling. Not opening, because he had glued it shut, but jiggling as if something was trying to open it anyway. That might be one of the most unsettling details of all, because it suggests intention. It suggests not just a random haunting around the object, but something focused specifically on that door, on that repeated act of opening it, on trying to continue doing what it had done before even after we physically blocked it. I never personally saw the clock do anything else after that. I did not witness the door opening again. I did not see it ripped off the wall a second time. But even now, when I think about that kitchen, that clock still gives me an eerie feeling. Some objects become heavy with memory after enough strange things happen around them. You can look at them and still feel the fear of what they once did, even if they are hanging quietly and doing nothing at all. That is how that clock became for me. It was no longer just something that told time. It had become part of the spirit in the house, part of the anger, part of the way the place announced itself. And the strange focus on clocks did not stop there. Other clocks in the house would go off on their own too. Alarm clocks would suddenly sound in the middle of the day or at odd times in the evening while the whole family was sitting at the dinner table. It was not one clock and one strange event. There seemed to be a pattern around time itself. The kitchen clock had the door that opened by itself, and then the violent fall. Other clocks would ring without reason. It began to feel like time mattered to whatever was there. That thought stayed with me. Even after the worst of my fear passed, I kept wondering what it meant. Why the clocks? Why the repeated attention to them? Why the opening of the glass door over the face? Why the sudden alarms sounding for no reason? Why that violent ripping of the kitchen clock from the wall right after I had looked at it and thought about never seeing it happen for myself? The connection between time and the spirit still troubles me. Maybe it was attached to a certain moment. Maybe it was trying to mark something. Maybe it wanted attention whenever the family forgot about it. Maybe it was tied to someone's death, a lost hour, a repeated event, or some unfinished piece of the past that centered around time in a way we never understood. Or maybe it was simply one of the ways it had found to make itself known, using the most ordinary household symbols of order and routine to create fear. Because clocks do more than tell time. They structure life. They mark meals, sleep, work, school, and family rhythm. A haunting that interferes with clocks is, in a strange way, interfering with the shape of ordinary life itself. That is part of why I think the clock incidents felt so deeply unsettling. The kitchen was the center of daily life. The clock hung above the sink where everyone saw it. The family ate, cleaned, washed dishes, and moved through that room every day. For that object to become active, to open on its own, to frighten my younger sister while she did the dishes, and then to be torn off the wall in front of me with all that anger behind it, felt like a message that nowhere in the house was fully safe from whatever lived there. I have replayed that night in my mind many times. I remember the coloring book. I remember the Lady in Death picture. I remember glancing up at the clock and having that little thought in my head. Why have I never seen the door open? Then I remember standing up, walking toward my bedroom, stepping into the kitchen, and looking up at exactly the wrong or right moment, depending on how you see it. Because if I had entered the room 10 seconds later, maybe I would have only heard the crash and never known what happened. If I had entered the room 10 seconds earlier, maybe nothing would have happened at all. But I walked in at the exact moment the clock was ripped off the wall. That timing has always bothered me. It is hard not to feel that it was purposeful, especially because I had just been thinking about it. That may sound strange, but in houses with enough activity, you start noticing the ways attention and events seem to meet each other. The moment you think of something, it reacts. The moment you speak about something, something answers. The moment you wonder why it has not happened to you, it happens. That is what this felt like. It felt like an answer. A violent one. And then there is that growl. I know some people would say that in the shock of the falling clock, my mind probably added that detail afterward. Maybe they would say the crash of metal and glass and would turn into something that sounded like a growl because I was already terrified. I understand why someone would say that. But I know what I felt too. There was something more in that moment than just the sound of a clock falling. There was a presence in it. An ugly pulse of anger that came toward me as the clock came down. Even if I could not prove the sound itself, I know the energy I felt. And that energy was hostile. That is what made the experience more than just a strange mechanical accident. If the clock had simply slipped and fallen, I would have been startled. Instead, I felt attacked. That is a very different thing. My father's reaction afterward also mattered to me because he was not the kind of person who would casually agree that something paranormal had happened unless the physical evidence pushed him in that direction. When he saw the bent nails still in the wall, when he saw the grooves dragged into the back of the clock, and when he said it looked like someone had ripped it off, that gave shape to what I had witnessed. It was not only fear speaking. The object itself showed signs of force. Even after the clock was glued shut, the idea that something kept trying to open that little door stayed with me. Why that door? Why not just the whole clock again? Why the repeated focus on the face of the clock, on the thing that covers the time itself? There is something symbolic about that, even if I cannot fully explain it. It feels almost like the spirit was not only interested in the object, but in what it represented. And then there were the alarm clocks. Those incidents seem smaller on paper, but in a haunted house, small repeated things can become just as unsettling as one dramatic event. An alarm clock sounding off in the middle of the day while the whole family is eating dinner is not something you dismiss forever after it happens enough times. It becomes part of the atmosphere. It becomes another reminder that ordinary objects do not always stay ordinary in a house like that. That is why I still wonder about time. Maybe the being was tied to a death that happened at a certain hour. Maybe it was trapped in a repeating moment. Maybe it measured itself against time because time mattered more to it than it did to us. Maybe it was trying to tell us something and chose clocks because they were the clearest way to do that. Or maybe time mattered only because the house itself held layers of the past, and the spirit's entire existence there was bound up with memory, repetition, and old moments that had never fully ended. I wish I knew. That is the hardest part of so many hauntings. You get the event, the fear, the object, the repeated behavior, the feeling of meaning, but not the explanation. You can live for years with the signs of something and still never know what exactly it wanted, or why it chose the ways it did to reveal itself. In this case, I was left with an enduring image. A clock above the sink. A secure latch. A family used to seeing the little door open by itself. A younger sister frozen with fear at the sink. Me sitting nearby coloring death in a medieval book. A thought passing through my head. Then the violent tearing of the clock from the wall. Forks and knives flying across the room. A faint growl. A burst of angry force. My father later standing there, holding the clock, seeing with his own eyes that it had been ripped free, not simply dropped. And then the quieter aftermath. Glue. New nails. Jiggling at night. Other clocks sounding for no reason. And me, years later, still wondering why time seemed so important to whatever had lived in that house. I do not have a final answer to that. I only know that from then on, every time I stepped into that kitchen, I felt it. Even when nothing happened. Even when the clock sat still and harmless on the wall. The room never felt the same again. Some places change forever after one violent moment, and some objects seem to keep a memory of what happened through them. That kitchen clock became one of those things for me. It stopped being part of the background and became part of the haunting. Maybe that is what the spirit wanted. Not just to frighten us in one instant, but to leave behind a feeling that would remain long after the crash was cleaned up and the forks were picked off the floor. A haunted house is not built only out of dramatic events. It is also built out of the memory those events leave behind, the way they change how you move through a room, look at a wall, or hear the sound of a clock somewhere in the next room. That clock did that to me. And even now, when I think about it, I still feel that same question moving quietly in the back of my mind. Why time? Why clocks? Why that door? Why that night? Maybe one day I will understand it. Maybe I never will. But I know that whatever was in that house cared about time in some way, and whatever that meaning was, it was strong enough to bend nails, tear wood, and send fear straight through me in one unforgettable burst of rage. I first started feeling strange things when I was in my preteen years. Back then, I slowly became known in my family as the one who noticed things other people did not. At first, I did not think much of it. I would get odd feelings in certain houses, in certain rooms, or around certain people, and I would mention them because I thought maybe everyone else noticed them too. But that was not what happened. Instead of taking me seriously, people in my family started calling me the ghost hunter. It became a joke. At family gatherings, people would ask me if I had seen any ghosts lately or if I had any new spooky stories to tell. They laughed about it, and even though some of them were only teasing, it still made me feel embarrassed and singled out. After a while, I got tired of it. I got tired of people acting like I was making things up, or that I was strange, or that my feelings were just another source of entertainment for everyone else. So I started shutting it down. I forced myself to ignore things. I stopped talking about what I felt, even when I clearly felt it. In a way, I buried that part of myself because it was easier than being laughed at every holiday, every birthday, and every family dinner. Over time, I got so used to ignoring it that many of those early experiences faded away. There are only one or two from those younger years that I still remember clearly. The rest feel blurred, like things I lived through but forced myself not to keep. On the outside, I became what everyone wanted me to be. I became a normal teenager in the eyes of my extended family, and that seemed easier for everyone. Now, years later, things are happening again, but this time not only to me. Now it is my teenage daughter who seems to attract things. That is what disturbs me most. I can ignore my own feelings. I learned how to do that years ago. But when it starts happening around your child, that is different. It changes everything. It stops being about embarrassment or family jokes and starts becoming something that feels urgent. I can no longer pretend it is nothing because too many things have happened, and too many people in the house have noticed them. What makes it even more unsettling is that we also have a 4-year-old son, and he sometimes says things that are hard to explain. He talks about things that happened before, things he should not know, almost as if he remembers another life or another time. He gives us timelines, in the strange but serious way that only a small child can. Sometimes he warns us about things before they happen. Of course, there is always the chance that he is simply an imaginative child, one of those rare children who tell stories so naturally and so confidently that adults are left staring at each other and wondering what they just heard. But there are moments when it does not feel like simple imagination. There are times when he says things in a way that feels too sure, too calm, too rooted in something older than him. The first time I really began to understand that this might not just be in my head was around 9 years ago, when our daughter was 6 years old. At that time, we were living in a mobile home park in Goshen, Indiana. The homes there were very close together, close enough that sounds from one place easily traveled into another. Because of that, in the beginning, we explained away a lot of what we heard. If footsteps sounded strange, maybe it was the neighbors. If there was a bang or an odd voice in the distance, maybe it was just sound carrying across the park. We wanted normal explanations, and the closeness of the homes gave us many chances to find them. Still, some things were harder to explain. At night, in the middle of the quiet, we would hear running footsteps down the hallway. Not random creaks or shifts in the floor, but clear running footsteps. And they always moved in one direction, always toward the master bedroom. Never away from it. Never back and forth. Always coming down the hall as if someone small and quick were hurrying toward our room. At first we tried to tell ourselves it must be sound from outside or from another trailer somehow echoing strangely. But even then, it never really felt right. Our daughter seemed to sense more than she could explain. In the master bathroom, there was a garden tub, and around the his and hers sink area there were 8 mirrors. The mirrors were all over the walls and the space around the counters. There was even glass in the door. It was one of those rooms that adults might think was attractive, but for our daughter, it became a place of deep discomfort. If she wanted to play in the tub, I would have to cover those mirrors. I had to cover the walls, the countertop mirrors, and even the glass on the door, because she simply would not feel safe in that room otherwise. If the heavy double glass doors were left open, she insisted they had to be closed. She could not relax in there unless the room felt shut off and hidden. She was too young then to give me a clear reason. She did not say she saw someone in the mirror or that someone was standing behind her. She just was not comfortable. Her discomfort felt instinctive, strong, and immediate. Her bedroom in that mobile home was in the front of the house, with the window facing the street. The neighborhood itself was quiet and, for the most part, trustworthy. There was no real reason for a young child to feel unsafe simply because of the window, but she always wanted it covered. It was not a passing preference. It was important to her. She also had a walk-in closet in that room with sliding doors, and those closet doors would sometimes lift right off their track in the middle of the night. Her bathroom shared a wall with that room and was decorated exactly the way a little girl might dream of. It should have felt cheerful and safe. But she could not walk into it alone. At first, we thought the problem might just be the layout. The front door was directly across from that bathroom door, and we figured maybe she was nervous because if someone opened one door while someone else opened the other, they could hit into each other. It seemed like a reasonable explanation. But deep down, even then, I did not fully believe that was all it was. Her fear went beyond normal childhood caution. It had a sadness to it, a heaviness. Eventually she stopped sleeping in that room altogether. When we asked her why, she could not give us a strong, clear answer. She did not say someone was in there. She did not say she saw monsters or heard voices. She only told us that it was a dark, cold room and that it made her sad. That was the language she had for it. Not scary. Not haunted. Sad. Dark. Cold. Those are very specific feelings for a child to describe, and the way she said them stayed with me. If she had a friend over, she would not let that friend stay in the room for long. They would go in only long enough to choose a few toys, and then they would come right back out to play in the living room. It was almost as if she knew the room was not meant for lingering. Like she wanted the toys, but not the space they were in. By that point, even my husband had had enough. A new baby was on the way, and our daughter's discomfort had become too much for him to keep brushing aside. He is the kind of father who can handle stress, noise, and ordinary family chaos, but seeing his little girl uncomfortable in her own room was something different. I think something in him reached a limit. He decided that we needed to move. About a week before we were supposed to move into a 3-story house in another city about 17 miles away, the three of us were lying on the bed in the master bedroom talking to our daughter about all the changes ahead. She was going to have a new school, new friends, new neighbors, and in many ways a whole new life. For a 9-year-old, that is a huge thing to take in. We were trying to comfort her, telling her that even if the circumstances changed, we would still be the same family. We were lying there talking and looking up at the ceiling fan, trying to make everything sound hopeful and safe. Then the fan began to spin. Slowly at first. None of us had touched it. My husband checked the wall switch. It was off. He checked the pull cord. It was off too. There was no breeze coming through the house, and there were only the three of us in the room. Yet the fan had started moving on its own. It was one more moment, one more small answer from the house, one more reason to feel like moving out was the right choice. When we moved to Elkhart, Indiana, things seemed calm at first. For a while, it really looked like our daughter was adjusting well. She made new friends. She got used to the new neighborhood. The house itself was different from the mobile home in almost every way. It was a 3-story house. Our bedroom was upstairs at the head of the hall. Our daughter's room was across from ours. Our son's room was at the very end of the hall, farthest from the stairs. On the surface, it felt like a fresh start, exactly what we had hoped for. Then one night our daughter woke us up and told us she had been hearing something that sounded like gunshots, or a car backfiring. The sound, she said, was coming from her closet. Her closet was huge, about 15 by 80 feet, a long walk-in space that previous tenants had apparently used more like attic storage. When we moved in, the reconstruction of the house was still going on, and the carpeting had not even been laid in there yet. It was mostly empty because she did not have nearly enough clothes or things to fill it. So at first we tried to explain the sound as an echo, maybe from the road, bouncing in the empty closet space in a strange way. But that was only the beginning. Her room stayed cold, unnaturally cold. Not just cooler than the others, but always the coldest room in the house. We tried everything. We gave her space heaters. We put electric blankets on the bed. We placed heaters out in the hallway. We turned the thermostat up high during the day, thinking maybe the whole house needed more time to warm up evenly. We had the furnace checked. We kept doors open to try to improve heat flow. Nothing changed. That room never felt right. Our son's room shared one wall with our daughter's closet. He was still a baby then and still sleeping in our room, so his room was mostly empty, but things began happening there too. The door would slowly shut on its own. I watched it enough times to know it did not feel natural. I never saw a shape behind it, but I always felt like something was standing there using it. Not slamming it, not pushing it quickly, but slowly and deliberately closing it while watching the stairs, almost like a child who has been sent to their room and is waiting to see who will come next. The strange part was that the carpeting was thick and plush, and it took real force to move that door. It was not something that drifted shut from a little draft. Around that same time, our daughter made a new friend. This friend, unlike normal childhood friends, was not someone we ever got to meet. She would sit in the closet with the heavy metal accordion-style doors pulled open and talk and play there for hours. She seemed comfortable there in a way that made me uneasy because the closet itself felt wrong to me. In our son's room, musical toys would suddenly start playing by themselves. CDs and tapes would not play properly in that room, but if we took the same portable player into another room, it worked perfectly. At the same time, our daughter began having stomach problems over and over again, and she also started developing behavioral problems at school after choosing that room as her own. Then one morning, while coming down the stairs to get ready for school, she fell down 10 steps, got up at the landing, and then fell down the remaining 4. When we asked what had happened, she said she felt dizzy and just lost her balance. Twice. That explanation never sat fully right with me, but at the same time, what can you say? She was a child. Maybe she did get dizzy. Maybe something else happened. I still do not know. Things did not only happen to her. My husband, who weighed about 270 pounds and had the build of a wrestler, was once shoved up the stairs. On another occasion, something grabbed his ankle while he was running up the stairs to check on something. It left a hand mark. When we found him, he was lying on the carpet as if asleep. Moments like that are hard to explain away. A door drifting shut can be doubted. A cold room can be blamed on insulation. But a grown man being pushed and grabbed hard enough to leave a mark is different. We also had overnight guests who experienced things. Friends who stayed in the basement bedroom, which sat directly below the bathroom and our daughter's closet, reported having their toes gently played with. Some heard breathing when no one was there. One male guest said he felt someone sit down on the bed beside him, and he heard a rustle of fabric as if a person had settled themselves there. A friend who slept in our daughter's room while she was away one weekend became suddenly and violently ill. She was so sick she could not even get out of bed in time before vomiting. The strange part was that once we moved her to another room on the ground floor, all the symptoms stopped almost immediately. I had my own experience too. One day I was getting ready for work. I had finished my shower, come out, briefly spoken to my daughter before she left for school, and gone back into the bathroom. My husband was a stay-at-home dad then. I suddenly felt dizzy, the way you feel if you stand up too quickly, and the next thing I knew I was waking up on the floor with my son crying and my husband on the phone explaining that they had found me passed out. There was no medical reason for it. No one could explain why it happened. At that point I started seeking outside help. I spoke to a woman at work because I knew she and her husband were healers, and I asked about blessings for a house. Eventually, with 2 of her associates, we had the house blessed. We sent the men outside for a while, and my daughter was present with us during the whole thing. She kept saying she felt uneasy and that the whole thing was creepy. That reaction stood out to me because I had hoped the blessing would make her feel calmer, safer, more relieved. Instead, it seemed to disturb her even more. Then, a few days later, someone told me I needed to watch my daughter for signs of possession. That shook me badly. Maybe, they suggested, it was not the house at all. Maybe it was her. That idea frightened me more than the house ever had. A haunted house is one thing. A problem attached to your child is something else entirely. I did not know what to do with that fear, so I did the only thing I could think of. I enrolled her in outpatient therapy with a psychologist nearby who was known for dealing with the unknown. I hoped he would help us understand what was going on, and maybe tell us how to handle it. Instead, things got worse. The activity seemed to increase, and after 3 years of therapy, we still had no real answers and no useful direction. Eventually I took her out because it was not helping. 2 years ago, we moved again, about 4 miles away. This move had nothing to do with the activity in the old house. At least not directly. It was for completely separate reasons. But once we moved, the experiences did not stop. That was one of the hardest things to accept, because part of me had always hoped that if we got into the right home, things would settle. Instead, we started seeing the same patterns again. Our current house has an attic room that is unfinished and does not even have a full floor yet. Yet one day an insurance man came in and asked who lived in the attic. No one does. The door to that room opens on its own even though there is a hook lock on it. A friend came over with her 1-year-old child, and they will not return now. The baby toddled past the attic door and played at a little desk we had set up. Within minutes the child became sick and vomited. We took her outside and she was fine. Later we came back in to eat. She wanted to sit at that same desk. She ate there, and then after playing there again she got sick again. No fever. No new food. No obvious explanation. The house keeps up a pattern of small but constant activity. We get calls at all hours of the day and night where no one is on the other end. One of the bedroom doors opens by itself when no one is near it. Music is heard in one corner of the living room where there is no radio and no speaker. We put things away and later find them in places where we never would have stored them. Toys still go off on their own. There is an alcove just inside the front door that we use as a computer room, and that space is always the coldest room in the house. We even put plexiglass on the outside of the windows, and still the only way to be comfortable in there is to run a space heater. And now I am lost. I used to explain everything by saying it was just the ghost of the house. That was easier. It gave me something outside myself, and outside my children to blame. But if this is actually my daughter's energy, or if she is some kind of magnet, how do I fix that? She is 15 now. If she attracts this kind of thing, then I need to know how to help her, because I do not want her growing up confused and frightened, the way I was. I shut my own gift or sensitivity down so early that I no longer know how to guide someone through it. I have no ropes to show her because I cut my own years ago. And if it is not her, if it is ghosts following us from place to place or different spirits in different homes, then what am I supposed to do with that? How do I put them at ease? How do I help my family live in peace? And if we move again, what guarantee do I have that it will not just happen all over again? That is the hardest part. The not knowing. The not knowing whether it is the houses. The not knowing whether it is my daughter. The not knowing whether I buried something in myself years ago that now lives on through her. The not knowing whether my son is simply imaginative or whether he truly sees through some kind of veil that the rest of us can only guess at. All I know is that this has followed us too far and too long to ignore anymore. And I no longer have the comfort of calling it only a childhood phase, only a weird house, only family nerves, only coincidence. Too many things have happened. Too many people have seen too much. And now I need help understanding what this really is before it becomes something my daughter carries for the rest of her life the way I carried it in silence for so many years. About 3 years ago, something happened that still scares me every time I think about it. Even now, after all this time, if I let my mind sit on it too long, I get the same uneasy feeling I had back then. It is one of those experiences that change the way I look at strange things. Before all this, I believed in the supernatural only in a loose way. I liked ghost stories. I thought some things were weird and hard to explain. But most of the time, if something strange happened, I would immediately look for a normal reason. I would tell myself it was stress, coincidence, old houses making noise, or people scaring themselves. After what happened over those months, I stopped being able to do that so easily. It all began when my boyfriend was getting ready to move out of his apartment and into a duplex in the downtown area. The downtown part of town had a lot of old homes, most of them built sometime around the 1950s or even earlier. They were the kind of houses that had character, but also the kind of places where floors creaked, walls settled, and every room seemed to hold a little bit of old history in it. At first, none of that seemed important. It just felt like another move. He and his roommates were excited because the duplex was nicer than the apartment, and it had that old charm people always talk about as if it makes a place special. A day or two before they actually moved in, my boyfriend had a dream. Not just a normal dream either, but one of those very vivid dreams that stay with you after you wake up and leave you feeling like you have just lived through something real. In the dream, he was still in his old apartment, and something in that place was haunting him and his roommate. In the dream, he decided he was going to perform some kind of exorcism to force the ghost out. He told me that he was sitting on his bed doing some kind of meditation, trying to focus and push whatever it was away. Then suddenly the ghost of a young girl appeared in front of him. She was angry. She started throwing things at him and screaming over and over, "Get the fuck out of my house!" Not just once, but again and again. And behind her, there was a tall man hovering over her. He woke up shaken and called me right away. I remember how startled he sounded. At the time, I thought it was a creepy dream, but just a dream. People have weird dreams before moving all the time. Stress does strange things to the mind. That was how I explained it away then. I listened to him, told him it sounded scary, and then moved on like it was one of those things that would be forgotten in a day or two. After he and his roommates moved into the duplex, things seemed pretty normal for a while. He would still have the occasional bizarre dream, but we did not think too much about that. The move itself had gone smoothly. They were settling in, arranging rooms, unpacking, trying to get used to the new place. It was just life. At least that is what we thought. Then one day, all of us were outside on the porch. We were talking, relaxing, doing nothing unusual, when the neighbor from the other side of the connecting duplex came over. He started telling us about this really weird dream he had. At first I was only half paying attention, but then the details started sounding way too familiar. It was not the exact same dream my boyfriend had, but it was close enough to make all of us stop and look at each other. The feeling in both dreams was the same. The sense of something in the house, something that did not want people there, something heavy and strange. Hearing that from someone who lived in the connected side of the duplex was enough to make the whole thing feel different. After that, we all started noticing more. The dreams kept happening for a long time. Not every night, but often enough that they began to feel connected to the house rather than random. Then there were little things in the house itself. Lights would turn on for no reason. Floorboards would creak when no one was walking on them. A rocking chair would move when nobody was anywhere near it. On their own, maybe those things could be ignored. Old houses do strange things. People hear one sound and suddenly imagine 10 more. But when those little things start piling up beside the dreams, beside the weird feeling in the place, the mind starts making connections whether you want it to or not. By then, all of us were convinced there was something in the duplex. But at first, we did not think it was mean. That is the strange thing. In the beginning, even though it was creepy, it did not feel openly dangerous. It felt more like something was there, watching, maybe restless, maybe trying to get attention, but not hateful. That changed later. The first time I truly got scared for myself was not even in that house. I was at my own home, asleep in my own bed. I had been having a weird dream, the kind that feels strange but not terrifying. Then I started half waking up. I was in that awful state where you are not fully asleep and not fully awake either. You can sense the room around you, but you cannot move properly or think clearly. It felt like someone was in my bedroom. I could not see them properly, but I knew something was there. Then I felt this crushing heaviness on the top of my chest, like someone had sat down on me. I could barely breathe. I tried to pull in air, and it felt like my body would not let me. Then I felt something move my legs and force them down harder onto the bed. That was the part that sent fear straight through me. It was not just pressure. It felt like intention. Like something was holding me there. It took me a few minutes to catch my breath after I finally snapped out of it. When I sat up, my heart was racing and I felt completely terrified. I had never experienced anything like that before. I told my boyfriend all about it, and he immediately wondered if it had something to do with the girl and the tall man from his dream. That thought stayed with me in a way I did not like. Before that, the strange things had belonged mostly to the duplex. Now it felt like whatever this was could reach beyond it. Not long after that, things at the house got worse. One night my boyfriend called me after he got off work. He had gone home and was sitting in his room in the basement, playing guitar. He said he heard something in another room in the basement that startled him, but he tried to ignore it and kept playing. Then he heard what sounded like footsteps coming from upstairs. That was enough to make him panic. He grabbed the phone, ran outside, and called me from the yard. He was standing as far away from the house as he could get while still keeping the connection on the landline. I remember him sounding completely on edge, talking fast, trying to pretend he was not as scared as he really was. We stayed on the phone for quite a while. At some point during the call, he suddenly said there was a figure standing on the porch. The porch light was on, so he could see clearly enough to know it was not just a trick of the dark. He said there was a distinct shadow standing in front of the door, just there, not moving much, just standing. He would not go back near the house after that. He stayed outside until one of his roommates got home hours later. Only then would he go near the place again. That alone was enough to make all of us feel like something had shifted. It no longer seemed like random sounds and creepy dreams. It felt more active than that. Then, not too long later, I had another dream. This one happened while I was staying at my dad's house out in the country for a couple nights. I was sleeping in his office. The dream itself was mostly nonsense, the way dreams often are, but one figure in it stood out clearly. It was a girl. She had long, sort of bushy brown hair, glasses, and she was wearing this big puffy winter coat that looked like it was from the 1970s. She kept appearing over and over in the dream, glaring at me. There was nothing friendly or neutral about her expression. She looked angry, almost offended that I was there. At one point, while I was sleeping, it felt like someone was hovering over me. That feeling snapped me awake, but not in a full panic. I was more startled than terrified. I went back to sleep pretty quickly and did not think much about it afterward. Maybe a week later, I was with my boyfriend and casually told him about the dream because it had seemed a little odd. I described the girl. The long brown hair, the glasses, the big coat. The second I finished, he just stared at me. His eyes went wide and he did not say anything for what felt like forever. Then it hit me why. The girl in my dream matched exactly the girl he had seen in his first dream. Every detail. That was the moment things became far more real for me. Before that, I could still tell myself we were feeding off each other's fear. Maybe he told me some dream and later my own mind built something from it without me realizing. But I had never heard him describe her like that before. I had never known those details. Yet I had seen her anyway, in my own dream, in a different place, far from the duplex. That scared me more than almost anything else up to that point. After that, things quieted down a little for a while. Not forever, just enough that we almost started hoping it had passed. Maybe it had only been a phase. Maybe the house had settled. Maybe we had all gotten ourselves too worked up and the fear was fading. But then there was a party at the house, and one of our friends ended up sleeping on the couch that night. One of my boyfriend's roommates woke up around 6 in the morning and noticed she was gone from the couch. Later that day, she called and explained why. She said that around 4 in the morning she had heard someone walking around in the kitchen for a very long time. She had ignored it at first, assuming one of us was up getting something to drink or just moving around. She tried to go back to sleep. Just as she was drifting off again, she heard footsteps running very fast from the kitchen into the living room and stopping right in front of the couch where she was sleeping. She said she did not even stop to think. She jumped up, grabbed her stuff, and left the house in the cold at 4:30 in the morning. That was how scared she was. Only a couple nights after that, my boyfriend had what was probably the worst experience of all. He had another dream, but this one was so vivid he described it almost like a lucid dream, like he was aware inside it, and knew something was wrong. In the dream, he was trying to get out of the house, but he was trapped. He felt something pushing him down. He was stuck in the floor at about the waist, trapped halfway between the basement and the main level, as if the house itself was swallowing him. Something was trying to force him the rest of the way down. He struggled, trying to move, trying to speak, trying to wake himself up. He fought hard to pull himself out of it, and finally he woke. The second he opened his eyes, he looked over and saw something in the room. He said it was bluish and smoky, like part of a body. Not a full person, just a section of a woman's torso. It hovered there for about 5 seconds before dissolving into his books. He got a good look at it. It was not one of those things you half see and question later. He saw it. Then he did exactly what any terrified person would do. He ran upstairs as fast as he could and banged on his roommate's bedroom door. They ended up sitting on the couch while he tried to explain what had happened. As he was talking, the lamp suddenly turned itself on. Right there in front of both of them. That was enough. They stayed awake the rest of the night sitting out on the front porch, too afraid to go back inside. The next day, while he was alone in the house, he said he again started feeling like something was there with him. But this time, instead of panicking, he did something simple. He calmly told it to leave him and his friends alone. Strangely, after that, the activity slowed down. It did not stop all at once, but there was a shift. The house still felt off, and all of us were still uneasy about it, but the strong experiences became less frequent. Around that time, one of my boyfriend's roommates, who was Native American, asked his father for help. His father was a medicine man, and he came and did a cleansing on the house. After that, nothing happened again. At least nothing obvious. That was the end of the haunting in that duplex, but it was not the end of what it did to me. Before all this, I believed in the supernatural only enough to enjoy the idea of it. If something weird happened, I would always reach for the normal explanation first. I would tell myself there had to be a reason, even if I did not know it yet. I did not want to think I was losing my mind. I did not want to think the world was full of things beyond understanding. I liked neat answers. I liked logic. I liked the feeling that even if something scared me for a second, I could still put it back into some ordinary category and move on. Now I am not like that. Now I pay attention. Now, when something feels wrong, I do not laugh it off as quickly. Now, if someone tells me they had a dream that felt too real, or they heard footsteps in an empty room, or a child talks to someone unseen, I do not dismiss it just because I cannot explain it. Because I remember that girl. The one with the brown hair, the glasses, and the big puffy coat. I remember that my boyfriend saw her before we even moved in. I remember him dreaming that she screamed for us to get out of her house. I remember the tall man behind her. I remember the rocking chair moving, the floorboards creaking, the lights turning on, the footsteps in the hallway, the strange pressure on my chest in my own room, the figure on the porch, the friend fleeing in the middle of the night, the bluish torso dissolving into books, and the lamp switching on by itself while 2 frightened people sat staring at it. I remember all of it. And because of that, I no longer live the way I used to, pretending everything can always be explained away. There is one part of it I think about often, and that is the change in how the house felt. In the beginning, it seemed almost only territorial, as if something in that place did not like having us there. The dream of the girl yelling to get out of her house felt like that. Then later the activity became stranger, heavier, more personal. It reached beyond the house and into my own sleep. It stood on the porch. It ran toward people in the dark. It pressed down and held. That shift is what scares me most when I think back on it. It makes me feel like we did not just stir up some old harmless energy. We entered something already living in that place. And I still wonder about the man behind the girl. He was there in the first dream, hovering over her, larger, darker, less defined in my mind, but present. We focused so much on the girl because she was the one who shouted and appeared again in my dream, but what about him? Was he the real force in the house? Was she trapped there with him? Were they connected to each other or only to the place? Sometimes I think the girl was the one trying to warn us and the man was the one making everything worse. Other times I think maybe she was just as angry as he was. I do not know. That is another hard part of experiences like this. Even when they stop, they do not leave answers behind. They leave images, fear, patterns, and questions. I also think about how many of the worst moments happened in those states between sleeping and waking. Dreams, pressure and sleep, vivid images, that hovering feeling. It is so easy for someone from the outside to say that must mean it was all in our minds. But the problem is that the house itself kept answering too. The lamp, the footsteps, the rocking chair, the moving shadows, the friend hearing someone run up to the couch, the neighbor having similar dreams. Too many things happened outside of sleep for me to believe sleep alone explains it all. And then there is the cleansing. Whatever that medicine man did, it worked. That, more than anything, is what made me stop making excuses in my own head. Because if the whole thing had only been stress, fear, suggestion, or coincidence, then why would a cleansing change the atmosphere so completely? Why would the activity stop after that? The timing was too exact to ignore. Something ended there. Even now, years later, I do not tell this story lightly. It still scares me. There are parts of it that I do not like to sit with for too long, especially late at night. The thought of something standing over you in that half-sleep state, the feeling of being pressed down and unable to breathe, the image of footsteps rushing toward a couch in the dark, all of that stays with you. But at the same time, I am grateful in a strange way for what it taught me. It taught me not to mock what I do not understand. It taught me that old houses can carry more than old wood and old nails. It taught me that dreams can matter. It taught me that sometimes several people can experience pieces of the same thing and not fully understand it until later. And it taught me that once you truly see enough, you do not get to go back to being the same skeptic you were before. I still look for logical explanations first. I do not think every odd noise is a ghost or every bad dream is a haunting. I think fear can make people imagine things, and I think old houses naturally produce strange sounds. But now I also know there are moments that do not fit so neatly into those boxes. There are moments that stay too sharp, too connected, too repeated across too many people to be ignored. That duplex was one of those moments stretched out over months. And even now, every time I think about that time, I feel it all over again. The move. The dream. The girl screaming to get out. The tall man behind her. The neighbor's similar dreams. The lights. The rocking chair. The floorboards. The crushing pressure on my chest. The figure on the porch. The dream at my dad's house. The coat. The glasses. The look on my boyfriend's face when he realized I had seen the same girl. The friend fleeing at 4:30 in the morning. The bluish torso. The lamp turning on by itself. The two of them sitting on the porch all night because they were too scared to go back in. And finally, the calm after the cleansing. It changed me. That is the simplest truth I can give. Before that house, I thought weird things always had a normal answer if you looked hard enough. After that house, I stopped being so sure. My husband and I used to live in a small 2-bedroom house out in the country. It was a quiet place for the most part, the kind of house that sat back from everything and felt tucked away from the world. It was not a big house, and it did not have anything fancy about it, but it was peaceful in a way that felt comforting. The rooms were simple, the walls plain, and the house had that worn feeling old country homes often have, where every floorboard and every doorway seems to hold years of ordinary life inside it. Even though the house had 2 bedrooms, we almost never used the larger one for sleeping. Instead, my husband and I preferred the back bedroom, which was a little smaller. It was farther from the road, so there was less noise from passing cars, and in the mornings it stayed darker longer because the sun did not hit it as strongly. It simply felt better for sleeping. It was quieter, calmer, and more private, and over time that became our room. At first, there was nothing about that bedroom that frightened me. It was just another room in the house, no more and no less important than the others. I would sit in there during the day sometimes, reading or working or just enjoying a little quiet. Like many old houses, ours had small oddities you learned to live with. A door might not shut right unless you lifted it a little first. A floorboard might creak in the same place every time you stepped on it. A draft might slip through somewhere you could never quite find. None of that seemed unusual. It was part of living in an older place. You noticed it, then you got used to it, and after a while it became part of the background of everyday life. One afternoon, I was lying on the bed in that back bedroom with a few books spread around me and my laptop open nearby. It was a quiet kind of afternoon, the sort where nothing feels rushed. I was not asleep, and I was not half dreaming. I was fully awake, just resting and reading and shifting around from time to time the way people do when they are comfortable and in no hurry to be anywhere else. At some point, I rolled over to ease my neck and happened to look up toward the ceiling. That was when I noticed the ceiling fan. It was turning. At first, I just stared at it without really processing what I was seeing. It was moving so slowly that it almost did not look like movement at all. But it was turning, one blade after another, with a lazy, deliberate motion. What made it so strange was not just the fact that it was moving. It was how slowly it was moving. Even on its lowest setting, that fan had never turned that slowly before. This was slower than low. It looked almost unnatural, as though it were being pushed by something weak and steady instead of powered by electricity. And the stranger part was that I had not turned it on. I knew I had not turned it on because I had not needed it on. The room was not hot enough to want it running, and I had not touched the switch. I remember lying there and thinking how odd it looked, because there was something almost careful about the way it moved. It was not spinning up or slowing down in the normal way an electric fan does. It was simply turning, slowly and evenly, as if it had already been doing it for some time. I watched it without moving. I do not know exactly how long I stared at it, but it was not more than a minute or so. Then, just as quietly as it had been moving, it stopped. Nothing else happened. There was no sudden noise. No feeling of cold. No shadow crossing the room. No strange sensation crawling over my skin. I did not feel watched. I did not feel threatened. I did not even feel especially scared in that moment. More than anything, I felt puzzled. It was strange, yes, but it did not strike me as terrifying. I knew the stories people tell about supernatural things, how they describe feeling dread or panic, or a heavy presence in the air. I felt none of that. It was simply a weird moment in the middle of an ordinary day. Because the house was old, I tried to explain it in a practical way. Maybe there had been some kind of electrical surge that caused the fan to move. Maybe something in the wiring had briefly kicked on. That seemed possible, at least at first. But if that had happened, I thought maybe the lights would have dimmed or flickered, and they had not. Everything else in the room had seemed completely normal. Another thought was that perhaps a draft had somehow caught the blades just enough to move them. Old houses can breathe in strange ways. Air slips through cracks you do not notice. Maybe that was all it was. But the windows and exterior doors were closed, and the movement had seemed too steady for a random current of air. Still, I could not prove anything. Since it never happened again, I let the matter rest, at least on the surface. After that, though, I began paying closer attention to the room. It was not that I suddenly believed something haunted it. It was more that once you notice one strange thing, your mind starts quietly collecting other details it might have ignored before. Small things. Easy things. Things that do not seem important until you place them next to each other and realize they may not be separate at all. The first thing I started thinking about was our dog. We had a dog who moved easily through the rest of the house. She had her favorite spots like most dogs do. She would nap where the sun fell across the floor. She would follow us from room to room when it suited her. She liked being near us, especially when the house was quiet in the evenings. But once I began thinking about it, I realized there was one place she did not go. That bedroom. She would walk past it. She would stand in the doorway. Sometimes she would stop and stare into it. But she would not come in. Not ever, as far as I could remember. Once that thought came to me, I kept turning it over in my mind because it felt strange that I had never really noticed before. Dogs have habits, and their habits become so normal that you stop questioning them. But then I began replaying scenes in my memory. I could not remember her coming in at night to settle beside the bed. I could not remember her curling up underneath it for a nap. I could not remember her sitting with me while I worked in there or lying nearby while I read. She was willing to come as far as the doorway, but no farther. Before the fan incident, I had not attached much meaning to that. If she stood there and barked now and then, I assumed she was reacting to something outside the window. The bedroom window sat directly opposite the door, and I had always figured she was seeing movement in the shrubs, or a bird on the sill, or something else beyond the glass that had caught her attention. That sort of thing happens with dogs. They hear or see things people miss. It never seemed worth thinking about. It was not even frequent. Only a handful of times, really. But now, after seeing the fan turn by itself, those memories felt different. I started noticing the way she looked into the room. It was not casual. It was not curiosity. She did not step in and sniff around as dogs usually do when something interests them. She just stood there, watchful and hesitant, as if she had reached an invisible line she did not want to cross. There was no growling, no dramatic reaction, nothing that would have made a better story if I were trying to turn it into one. In some ways that almost made it stranger. She simply refused the room. Quietly, steadily, and without exception. That was when I started investigating. I already knew a little about the house because of how it had come to us. We had bought it from my husband's father, who had bought it from a friend. That meant the house had come with at least some family knowledge attached to it, even if only in bits and pieces. I began asking questions and trying to trace back who had lived there and when. I was not looking for anything dramatic. I only wanted context. If something about the place had always felt odd, maybe its history would explain why. What I found at first did not seem especially helpful. The house itself had been built in the 1960s by the mother of the previous owner's wife. That made it older, certainly, but not ancient. It was not some crumbling house from the 18th century. It was not the sort of place people point to and say it must have stories attached to it simply because of its age. In fact, when I learned it dated only to the 1960s, I felt a little disappointed. I had hoped maybe the house itself would hold some obvious key to what I had been feeling, and instead it seemed too new for that. But then I learned more. Before the newer house had been built, the same woman had lived on that property in a much older home. I was told it dated back to somewhere around the mid-1800s. From the way it was described to me, it sounded less like a proper house by modern standards and more like a rough barn-like structure that had been used as a home. Not much money had gone into it, and people in the area remembered it because it had stood there for so long before the new house replaced it. When the woman built the newer home in the 1960s, it had apparently caused a stir among some of the older neighbors. From what I heard, it was talked about because a woman of her class building a brand new house was not something people expected at the time. It was a big step. A point of pride, maybe even of struggle finally rewarded. That caught my attention. Suddenly the place felt layered in a different way. The house we lived in was newer, yes, but the land itself had held another life long before it. Another home. Another center of daily routine, family, work, hardship, and waiting. If people had lived there for generations, then the shape of the place extended beyond the walls around me. The bedroom I slept in might have stood over ground that meant something long before our house existed. The more I thought about that, the more I wanted to know. I tried speaking with the previous owner's mother, hoping she might tell me more. I did not go to her with wild questions or claims. I simply asked what I could in a respectful way. I wanted to know which bedroom her mother had used, where she had died, whether she had spoken about the old home that had stood on the property before the newer one was built. But she did not say much. In fact, she said almost nothing useful at all. She was very tight-lipped. The moment the subject turned toward her mother, the old house, or anything connected to death or the property's earlier history, she seemed to close up. It was not anger exactly, but it was clear she did not want to talk. She offered no stories, no explanations, no family details that might have helped place things in order. I had the strong sense that whatever feelings she had about it all were still close to the surface, even after so much time. She seemed upset by her mother's passing in a way that had not faded cleanly. Because of that, I did not feel right pressing her. There is a point beyond which curiosity becomes rude, and I did not want to cross it. Still, even in that silence, I learned a little. She had grown up in the newer house. Her older siblings, however, had been raised in the older one. That meant the property truly had bridged two different homes and likely two different eras of family life. One generation had known the rough old structure. Another had grown up in the newer house built by a woman who had perhaps worked and waited a long time for something better. That mattered to me, though I could not have fully explained why at the time. I went looking in other places for answers. Courthouse records showed the land and indicated that a home had once existed there before the newer one, but the documents were not exact in the way I hoped. Some of the old maps were hand-drawn and lacked clear measurements. They gave the shape of the property more than the precise placement of buildings on it. I studied what I could, trying to imagine where the first house had stood in relation to the one we lived in. It became something of a puzzle. Not one with clean edges or a final answer, but one of those half-faded pictures you stare at and slowly begin to make sense of. On the property itself, all that remained of the old house were scattered traces. A few stones from what had once been the porch. Some broken china pieces that had washed down into a gully. Rusty tools buried in the ground where the front yard likely had been. Nothing dramatic, nothing large, nothing whole. Just fragments. But fragments can speak in their own way. They told us roughly where the old house must have stood. They marked a shape on the land, even if only faintly. And once I had that rough location in mind, I could not stop comparing it to the newer house. Something about it never sat right with me. I kept thinking about the fan turning on its own. I kept thinking about the dog refusing that bedroom. I kept thinking about the daughter who would not speak of her mother or the old house. None of those things proved anything. I knew that. I still know that. A ceiling fan can move for reasons you never discover. A dog can dislike a room for reasons that have nothing to do with spirits. Families can grow silent around grief simply because grief changes how people speak. Each detail by itself could mean almost nothing. Yet together they created a feeling I could not shake, a quiet sense that the room and the land beneath it held more history than anyone had chosen to tell. A couple of years later, my husband and I moved to the family farm in the same area. Life changed the way it does. We were no longer living in that little two-bedroom house, and with distance the strange details should have faded into something merely curious. But they did not. Every now and then we would ride by the old place, and each time I would look at it and think back to that room. Back to the fan. Back to the dog standing in the doorway. Back to the questions that had never been answered. It was only after several years of passing by that house that another detail clicked into place for me. The bedroom window. The same window our dog used to bark at from the doorway. Once I compared the likely location of the older house to the newer one, I realized that bedroom window would have faced in a direction directly perpendicular to what would have been the front yard of the old home. In other words, if you stood where that window looked out, you would be looking across toward the area where the older house had once opened itself to the world. To its front. To the place where people would have come and gone. Where life would have gathered. Where someone might have stood and looked every day for years. That realization gave me chills in a quiet way. Not because it proved anything supernatural, but because it tied together things I had felt without understanding. If our dog had been staring and barking toward that window, and if that window looked toward the old house's former front yard, then perhaps she had not been reacting to shrubs or birds at all. Perhaps, if animals really do sense things we do not, she had been focused on something connected to that older place. Something still rooted in the land. I often think about how different it all was from the way ghost stories are told now. This was before everyone carried phones capable of taking endless pictures and videos, before the whole culture of digital ghost hunting had really taken hold the way it later would. We did not think to document things. We did not set up cameras. We did not walk around trying to capture evidence. Part of me wishes we had. I wish we had taken photographs of the room, the window, the yard, the stones, the fragments of china. I wish I had recorded the dog in the doorway or made some attempt to preserve what I now only hold in memory. But at the time, life does not feel like a story. You do not know which moments will matter years later. You simply live them, and by the time you understand their shape, they are already in the past. Even without proof, the feeling has remained with me. There is one more detail that has stayed in my mind all these years. The daughter of the woman who built that newer house eventually moved from Chicago and built her own house in a nearby area. In her sitting room, she has a mural of her mother's house, the very house my husband and I once lived in. That detail touched me in a way I cannot fully explain. It told me that the house still mattered deeply to her, not just as real estate or family property, but as memory, as love, as a place still worth putting on a wall and seeing every day. And that brings me back to the thought I have never fully let go of. If the daughter loved that home enough to keep its image near her for all those years, maybe her mother had loved it just as fiercely. Maybe more. Maybe that house was not simply a structure she lived in. Maybe it was the thing she had worked for, waited for, hoped for while living in the rough old place before it. Maybe building it had meant finally arriving somewhere she had long wanted to be. Maybe it had represented safety, pride, comfort, rest, or the simple reward of finally having a true home after years without one. If that was true, then perhaps leaving it was not easy, even in death. I do not say that lightly. I am not the sort of person who wants every strange event to become a haunting. I know how easily ordinary things can take on extra meaning once you connect them in hindsight. I know memory reshapes itself around mystery. But even with all that said, I cannot shake the feeling that the room held something of that woman still. Not in a violent or angry way. Not in some dramatic, frightening sense. Nothing in that house ever felt malicious to me. Nothing attacked. Nothing threatened. If anything was there, it felt quiet, almost patient. Present, but not cruel. Like a person lingering in a place that mattered too much to leave behind. When I think back to that fan, I do not remember fear. I remember stillness. I remember the kind of silence that makes one small movement seem larger than it should. I remember watching the blades turn slowly overhead, as if the room itself had exhaled. And I remember the way it stopped without explanation, leaving me to sit with a question instead of an answer. When I think of our dog, I remember that same stillness. Not panic. Not wild barking or cowering. Just a quiet refusal. A steady watchfulness at the threshold, as if she knew there was something in that room that was not for her to enter. Dogs cannot tell us what they sense. We fill in the blanks with our own ideas. But the truth is often in what they do not do, and our dogs simply would not cross that doorway. When I think of the woman's daughter refusing to speak, I do not assume it was because she knew something supernatural. Grief can shut people down in ways outsiders never understand. Perhaps she was only protecting a memory too painful to disturb. Perhaps every question about the house reopened something she could not bear revisiting. Yet even that silence feels like part of the story to me. The house remained emotionally alive for her, and emotions have a way of lingering around places as strongly as footsteps do. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had known more while I still lived there. Would I have spent more time in that bedroom, sitting quietly and paying attention? Would I have asked aloud whether anyone was there? Would I have felt foolish doing so? Or would I have sensed something answer back in the small ways old houses sometimes seem to answer, with a shift of air, a creak from the walls, a movement so slight you cannot say for certain it happened? I will never know. The chance to know passed with the years. I also wonder whether anyone who lived there after us ever noticed anything. Maybe they did and never said. Maybe they experienced nothing at all. Places can change with the people inside them. Or maybe people simply notice different things. It is possible that what I felt belonged only to that season of our lives, when the room and the land and my own attention happened to line up in just the right way for those details to stand out. That is part of why the story stays with me. It never resolved itself. There was no final event, no dramatic ending, no unmistakable proof. Just a handful of moments and discoveries that slowly formed a pattern. In some ways, that makes it more believable to me, not less. Real-life mysteries are rarely neat. They do not arrive with music and shadows and a perfect reveal. More often they slip quietly into ordinary days and leave behind nothing but a feeling you cannot explain. The little house itself was easy to overlook if you did not know its history. It sat there like so many country homes do, modest and practical, carrying on without announcement. But I think now about all the life that had passed through that land before we ever came along. The older house from the 1800s. The woman who lived there with little money, long before she built the newer place. The neighbors who watched and talked when the new house went up. The children raised first in one house and then the other. The years of work, weather, illness, family, and loss that must have settled into that ground. None of that disappears just because a new roof goes up or a new family moves in. Maybe that is all haunting really is sometimes. Not a ghost in the way movies show it, but the persistence of love, labor, and memory in a place that once held them tightly. Maybe certain rooms gather feeling the way old wood gathers scent, and if you are quiet enough, you notice it. Maybe some people feel it through a fan that should not move. Maybe some animals feel it in a doorway they will not cross. Maybe some daughters feel it so deeply they paint it on their walls years after leaving. I cannot say for sure what happened in that bedroom. I cannot prove that anything supernatural ever took place there. I still see the practical explanations. An electrical quirk. A draft. A nervous dog with a habit we happen to read too much into later. Old records and old stories turning coincidence into mystery. All of that remains possible. And yet, even with every reasonable explanation laid out in front of me, the feeling remains. I think of that woman, building a new house in the 1960s after living in something much rougher and older. I think of what that must have meant to her. I think of the care she may have put into choosing where each room would be, what each window would face, how the house would sit on the land she already knew so well. I think of her growing old there. I think of the bedroom, the quiet, the dog in the doorway, and the fan turning overhead one still afternoon, while I lay on the bed with my books and laptop, not expecting anything unusual to happen. And I think maybe she loved that home too much to leave it easily. Maybe she stayed in the only way she could. Not to frighten anyone. Not to drive us out. Not to make her presence known in some terrible way. But simply because that was her home, the place she had waited for, worked for, and perhaps treasured more than anyone realized. If so, then what I felt was not a haunting in the frightening sense at all. It was something gentler. Something quieter. The lingering trace of someone who could not quite give up the place that had meant everything to her. That is why the memory has never really gone away from me. It was not the kind of experience that leaves you with terror. It leaves you with questions. With a kind of respectful unease. With the sense that the world may hold more than we can measure, and that homes sometimes keep pieces of the people who loved them most. I still wish I had photos. I still wish I had more records, more exact maps, more conversations, more courage perhaps to ask the questions that felt too personal at the time. But maybe part of this story's power lies in the fact that it remains incomplete. It lives in fragments, just like the old house itself lived on in a few stones, broken china, and rusty tools hidden in the ground. Nothing whole. Nothing final. Just enough to suggest what once stood there. And maybe that is enough. Because even now, when I picture that house, I do not picture anything monstrous. I do not imagine a dark figure in the room or something waiting behind the doorway. I picture the bedroom in afternoon light. I picture the ceiling fan turning slowly, almost thoughtfully, over the bed. I picture a dog standing at the threshold, alert and uncertain. I picture an older house long gone from the land, and a newer one built with hope. I picture a daughter who still keeps that house in her sitting room because love for a place can outlast time, distance, and death. And every time I think of it all together, I come back to the same quiet feeling. Perhaps she never wanted to leave. Perhaps, after all that work and waiting, after all the years it took to build a better home for herself, she stayed close to it in whatever way she could. Perhaps that was all it ever was. Not something evil. Not even something frightening. Just someone who loved her home too much to let it go.